The Messy Podcast is sponsored by Eternity Bible College. Eternity is dedicated to providing a debt-free education with courses taught by hands-on practitioners just like myself. To learn more, visit eternity.edu. Welcome to the Messy Podcast, a podcast about the messiness of life and the transforming power of the gospel. Scott Mehl here, and this week I'm talking with Darby Strickland. Hey, Darby.
Hey, how are you?
Doing good. Darby, just for a little background, Darby's a counselor and faculty member at the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. She's an author of Is It Abuse? Biblical Guide to Identifying Domestic Abuse and Helping Victims. She's also a contributor to the free web-based training curriculum, Becoming a Church That Cares Well for the Abused. And she has a Master's of Divinity in Counseling from Westminster, where she currently teaches a course on counseling and abusive marriages. And she and her husband, John, take great delight in homeschooling their 3 children. That's having homeschooled your 3 children. I heard at least one of them's in college now?
One of them's in college, so one's off. Yep.
Awesome. That's what a fun season. So that's a super fun season. We're obviously connecting to talk not necessarily about a fun topic, but a important topic, one that I'm super thankful that we're talking more about and thankful for your work on. As I mentioned to you previously, I actually just in what'll air is the previous episode talked with Craig Marshall about just about toxic headship in the church. And in the midst of that conversation, we kind of veered into the topics surrounding abuse, how to think about abuse, how to minister to abuse. And it's an area that while I've dealt with on numerous occasions, just simply as a pastor, I haven't dealt with it to the depth or the extent that you have. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to glean from you, and thankful for your time on this, Darby.
Thank you for highlighting the issue. I think it's much more prevalent than we would want to believe in our churches. And so I always feel very grateful when people are bringing it up. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a reality that I think as a lot of pastors, and not even for bad reasons, we don't want to be honest about, but it's just sometimes it's hard to come to grips with the prevalence of it in our communities and even within our churches.
And it's not something we see, right? So, it makes sense. People aren't usually identifying this is my presenting issue, and oppressors aren't coming out and saying I abused my wife. So I think it's hard even just to identify in the church. So it's easy to think that it's not there.
Yeah, for sure. That's super helpful. Okay, but I mean, as we dive in, why don't we just start with what it is we're talking about, right?
Exactly.
The word abuse, I think, is used really widely. And I think sometimes actually it's even that lack of clarity on what it is we're talking about that even if people disagree about it, they might actually even agree on what we're talking about, but they're talking past each other because they're not using the same vocabulary.
Right. And abuse is a very loaded term, right? And so I think it's really helpful to have precise definitions. And I think what is abuse is a huge question. And sometimes we have to just start by saying what's not abuse, right? Because there is a lot of marital discord. There's a lot of marital disagreement. There might even be arguments that are particularly sinful. But when abuse arrives on the scene, it's when there's a pattern of behavior where someone's perpetually using power and control to dominate their spouse, to get their world the way they want it. And it's a relationship is actually characterized by certain behaviors. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about domestic abuse. There's this perpetual nature to it that is about domination.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in that sense, is it fundamentally just unrepentant in that sense? Or is that is what makes it perpetual that it's unrepentant? Or are those two different?
That's a good question, actually, because sometimes you have someone who is doing oppressive things to their spouse, who might apologize for, I'm sorry, I lost my temper, but they might not be repenting in the way you and I are saying, that they're hating their sin, that they have godly sorrow for what they've done. They're not coming up with a plan not to sin in the same way again, right? We can all kind of show worldly sorrow. And so when I'm thinking about a perpetual pattern is someone who isn't showing remorse in working off putting a particular sin pattern. And they might, right? The hard thing with abusers in general is they tend to be verbal manipulators. So they might apologize for some things or say they're sorry or minimize what they've done. So I think that makes it even harder. We actually have to look at and catalog the behaviors, or what is the person's behavior actually telling you about where their heart is at versus what are their words saying.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that even gets to the heart of, I think, what I would assume you and I mean by repentance, right? Which isn't simply word-based.
No, right.
Exactly. That requires actual response, a change in behavior, a change in actions, a change in words.
But many victims don't understand that, right? And so they hear, I'm sorry, or an elder might be sitting with a couple and they so desperately want to have a marriage reunited that they see a little bit of sorrow and they don't recognize the seriousness of what's occurred and what really should be happening next. Yeah.
And so the dynamics, the key dynamics, in a sense, even just to clarify in my own head, the key dynamics that you're talking about are like that unrepentant power dynamics, manipulation.
Coercive control is probably the best way to put it. Yeah.
Okay.
So when you have someone who's coercive, and you can use a plethora of different behaviors to coerce someone, right? But you're seeking to coercively control them. And that's different. Like you and I might struggle with control. I always teach from the example of like, I might like my dishwasher loaded a certain way, or I like my children to put their things away in a certain manner, right? We all have preferences. We all have tendencies to be controlling, right? And I think an abuse is fueled from entitled hearts that want their world the way they want it. And I think where we struggle is we all struggle with entitlements, and we all have little ways that we're controlling, small c, right? But what an abuser is willing to do is they are willing to wound and punish someone to get those things the way they want it. And then coupled with that is the repentance piece, is they really don't see the impact of their behavior, and it doesn't move them to change. So if I were to act in a controlling manner towards my children, someone would confront me, I'd be broken over my sin. I'd be like, oh man, I didn't know that was having that impact or effect. Oppressors are particular, abuse, it rises to a different level because of the punishment and the inability for them to see the impact or wanting to change the impact that they're having.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a helpful distinction.
That is super helpful. And I think particularly the concept of coercive control helps me, because I was going to ask, like, are there different kinds of abuse? And what I hear you saying then is, well, there are, but it's just different kinds of coercive control or different ways to go about. Is that what you'd be saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. So precisely. So some people are going to control in the area of finance. Right. And the tactics that they might use to control in finance, they could use shaming, verbal language. They might actually be physically violent to control in the area of finance. Right. Other people are going to control in wanting someone to be isolated and not have other healthy relationships. Right. That's something. And so they could use a variety of, they could just use a silent tactic after they've called their mom for like a week and not talk to their wife. Or they could be loud and brash and harsh and cruel and throw things. Like, so it's what's hard about abuse, and you're saying what is abuse, is oftentimes there's all these punishing behaviors that the victim doesn't necessarily even recognize as problematic or so shameful. She's not identifying for you. This is the way my spouse is punishing to me. But we have to go further than just the behaviors and understand the entitled self-worshiping heart that produces those behaviors is just so foreign to us that we kind of lack the imagination to see how far gone their desires are.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's...
I think that's super helpful. And so then what that does is it opens the door to different types of abuse, like financial abuse or emotional abuse, and helps us to see the significance, the impact of that. Right. So as you're talking, and maybe the categories get a little bit muddy to me, because then it feels like not all physical abuse would qualify as that type of coercion, or maybe it would. And so we're talking about, in a sense, like like physical abuse, though, is always abuse.
Always.
Right. Always abuse.
Well, it's always sin. I
not,
think the easiest thing for the church is to say that's always sin.
okay.
Right. And so sometimes even
100%.
there, it's like if we were uncomfortable with the word abuse there, that's serious and grievous sin that needs to be addressed immediately for someone's safety. And adding the abuse, right? When I add the word abuse to a sin pattern, all I'm doing is saying, now we have to consider the effects of that sin pattern on a particular human being, means we have to turn our attention to their safety, right? Yeah.
Okay. No, that is clarifying and actually helpful, and we're understanding then in abuse the relational dynamic that these acts of sin, that this unrepentant sin, that this coercive unrepentant sin has over the totality of the relationship and the way that it shapes and defines the relationship. Is that
exactly? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So then there seems to be then also, and I'm just trying to clarify this in my own head, because then I feel like there's things that someone could do that are abusive.
Correct.
Right. That maybe is a, but you use this word abuser that it's almost like identity giving, that if I'm honest, it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I feel like I get what you're saying, that this is what defines the nature of their relationship. What's the difference between like things that, like abusive things they do, and the reason you would use that term abuser or oppressor?
So in some sense, it's just semantic easiness, right? Yeah. And so I could talk to you for an hour about people who choose to do abusive behaviors, right? Which is really what we're talking about, right? I look at an abused person who perpetuates abuse in another human being, and I recognize that there's ways that they're sinning. There's ways, it's for Mike Emlet, right? There's ways that they're sinning. There's ways that they're suffering, and the ways that they're a saint and they're walking. And I want to have all three lenses on when I'm caring for them one-on-one, and I want to see them as a person. But when I'm working on a marriage where there is abuse present, the sin that they're perpetrating, right, creates a different triage of what I have to address first for safety reasons, right? And so for a shorthand, I will say an oppressor, someone who does oppressive things. And I don't by any stretch want that to be their sole identity. I want their identity ultimately to be in the Lord. But I'm just saying that sin pattern is so significant that I am giving it a label, but I wouldn't want to sit across from a man who does oppressive things and say you're an oppressor, right? That would not be helpful. I would want to say things to them. I see the way that you're dominating your wife. I see the way that the names that you're calling her. I'd want to use every verb and be precise about the things that they were doing versus giving them a label.
Okay. That's really clarifying for me. I think that's really helpful, because I think, and I also at the same time get the shorthand and get why I love the triage analogy, right? That when these things are present, when these dynamics are present, it's not like maybe a simpler marital conflict where you're stepping in and saying, okay, let's both remove the logs from our eyes. Let's both step towards one another. There's a manipulative power dynamic that needs to be taken into consideration for one spouse's safety, or maybe for the family's safety. Is what I hear
both
you saying.
Actually. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So in a sense, it kind of changes the way our ministry priorities, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I think that's super helpful too, because it maybe establishes our priorities, but then doesn't change the things that we're engaged in, right? There's still a compassionate care and process and journey for the one who's doing these abusive behaviors, and one that's patient, calling them to repentance,
long suffering with them. Right. And one way we do that is we want to limit their ability to sin against their spouse for a time period, right? Because in their redeemed self would thank you and saying, thank you for helping me not perpetrate these heinous acts, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
is one way we're loving them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The more I talk and the more questions I have, it makes me want to do like I need to do more and more like of these interviews and episodes and things like that. But so what I want to do though is I want to focus then on our conversation on caring for the abused. And I think that's where you've been like really helpful. I think there is a whole nother conversation to be had about how we care for those who are doing those and I want to do that. But in our conversation, I want to think about how we care for the abused. And as we jump into that, the last clarifying question I have is particularly in your book and you talk almost exclusively about the husband and his coercion of the wife. I feel like in my ministry, that's more often than not been the case. But I've also dealt, but not exclusively.
Right, exactly.
And so is that something you do because of that specific dynamic? And I guess how would you characterize whether this is a husband to wife only issue or whether wives are capable of the same type of coercion?
Well, we know that I always answer the question this way. We know that women are capable of abuse because we see them abuse children. Right? They can have the same fallen heart. However, in order to be the person who is abusive in the relationship, you have to have some sort of power in the relationship. There are Christian marriages where women do possess power. Sometimes they are the primary breadwinner. Sometimes their husbands are disabled. Sometimes they just have more social power, for lack of a better word, or influence, right? And so when there's that power differential and it leans in the woman's favor, certainly a man, and I have counseled them, can be a victim of domestic abuse. It is, I want to say it's like 90+% of Christian marriages, the wife is going to be the victim. Particularly a lot of our teachings on headship and submission and those type of things have really contributed to that dynamic of where those things lie in a relationship. I want to, and I recognize for male victims, it's going to be that much harder to be seen as a victim. If you're a male victim and you call the police, chances are they are going to arrest you because the prevalence, right? Yeah. And so when we suspect that there is a male victim, we want to be that much more careful. But all the same things apply. So I write because of the plethora of my experiences dealing with women victims, but also what the church tends to have missed was just seeing it among their daughters. Totally. So I just want,
Totally. Okay, I super appreciate that. And I figured that was the case. But I think it's helpful. And I know in my context particularly, I think there are increasingly more ministry contexts where maybe the traditional kind of Christian setup isn't like the only setup, but in that we open up the diversity to a more diverse context for potential sin in every direction, right? I mean, that's always true. And I also think that we need to. It is important, though, to keep our eye on the ball, recognizing the ways in which some of our cultural Christian values can cause us to paper over some of these dynamics and the abuse that is so important. So anyways, that's why I really am super thankful for the way you've highlighted this as well. So as we talk then about how we care for and minister to those that are abused, those are being abused, have been abused. When I think about gospel care, the definition I use for gospel care is the God-exalting, grace-saturated act of loving another person through patiently knowing, sacrificially serving, truthfully speaking, and consistently applying the gospel in order to help them become more like Jesus. And so I want to walk through kind of each of those, like knowing and serving and speaking and gospeling. But it makes me... I don't know, even in that definition, it makes me recognize that in order to help them become more like Jesus, like a prerequisite to that is their experience of the comfort of Jesus. It's not simply a transformation it's transformation not simply by means of conviction, but also by means of comfort knowing God, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think even like when you're saying knowing them,
yes,
right? And I think that's one of the things that was so difficult for me early on in counseling victims of abuse is I couldn't imagine the horrors that they were experiencing. I didn't understand the extent of the coercive control. So I would offer them relationship advice that would serve them well in a regular marriage. Or I would say, oh, this argument is happening. This is how you could de-escalate the argument. Not really understanding the dynamics of abuse because I didn't know what the patterns typically, right? Every case of abuse is different. Every marriage is unique, but there's certain contours, right? But I also didn't know, I wasn't equipped to ask specific questions, the person sitting in front of me, to really unearth what their world was really like.
Yeah. Okay. So help me with that then. What are the kinds of questions? I mean, again, each individual is different, and so each individual is going to have different questions. But what are the kinds of questions we should be prepared to ask or seeking to ask that will take us beyond, help us be able to identify when what's taking place is outside of the realm of just normal marital conflict? Yeah.
So one thing I think my book does is I ask there's probably 300 questions in there for counselors and pastors to use because there's just so many questions that have to be asked to be really precise. But I think just globally what you're looking for is what happens in a relationship when someone's sense of entitlement is so great that they're willing to punish the other person. So for instance, I'm going to be asking questions like, what happens when you disagree? How can you tell your spouse is angry? And I might say, do they throw things? Do they yell? Do they use curse words? I might throw a couple little things out there just to give them permission that I'm willing to receive an answer that isn't normal, right? That is more on the extreme ends of behavior. Are you fearful around your partner? And so I'm wanting to just give them, I want to know what happens when things break down. A lot of time in churches, somebody in the couple is bringing us a problem and we're focused on the content of the problem. We're having a budget issue. We don't know where to send our child to school. And we're trying to figure out a way to mediate or create unity, which is a good and godly goal between a couple. What we actually need to detect abuse is we have to kind of have the screenplay of what is it like to be in the room when those things are being discussed. So I'll say, how long did the conversation last? What were kind of things that were said? And it matters. Were they sitting at the kitchen table and were they getting stuck? Or was the conversation 3 hours long and he was following her around the house? So you really have to with some sort of precision, get a picture of what it's like to be in the room. Those are that's one set of questions. The other thing is victims don't typically know that they're being oppressed. So oftentimes victims will come into me for anxiety, fear. They'll often say, I don't feel like having sex with my husband. Help me create a desire for that. I'm feeling I'm not serving him well. And they'll give me an example or a story. But we need to slow down and ask again before we go into problem solving. We want to be, tell me more about that, or why are you asking that? And I think that's one thing to see abuse, you have to take in a lot of data. Maybe is another way. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's super helpful to me because what I hear you saying is that we need we need to understand the whole scene, right? And so just there's tons of questions that come from that. Right. But then if what we're after is trying to identify whether this was, a really rough night or a pattern of coercive control, then we're seeking to understand multiple scenes, multiple amounts of information.
Yep.
And that takes a lot of time. Like there's no like quick shortcut to that.
And I think that's we want to be comfortable with that, right? We want to when we use that label, we want to have a high confidence and enough stories and enough data, right? Enough examples. And it's okay not to be sure. I think for people, I say, if you suspect that there might be abuse, that's good. And just keep asking good questions, be wise and careful in how you're engaging the couple. You probably stop marriage counseling at that point, right? And be seeing people one-on-one, do all the things that you would do. But it's okay not to be sure. The Lord, right, is so kind. He will reveal, right? If we ask. Mm-hmm.
That's so helpful to hear. I mean, even as a pastor, it's helpful to hear because I feel like now not being sure drives me to want to know more, right? To have more information.
Right.
But I sometimes feel like the pressure that, okay, I've heard the story once. I'm supposed to know exactly how to categorize this or how to think about it. And I think that oftentimes I've learned this in counseling that when I'm confused, it's just because I don't have enough information. Yeah.
Right.
Like, and I think that sometimes we can take that. If I'm confused, that's not a failure.
Nope.
Of mine.
Right.
I'm often confused. But that just means that there's more to be had, more to be explored.
Right. And I say, so anytime that I feel confused, it just pushes me to be more curious.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I want to lean in and like using your categories, I want to know. Right. And I want to extract more information and understand that person's heart and what their situation's really like. Yeah. So I want to become curious, really a learner of that person.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're so often, I mean, I know it. I am like, I'm impatient to move beyond that. Right. Like, no, I need to figure it out so that I then can apply the right scripture or, and I mean, this is interesting. I feel like I've been having a number of conversations in this context as we do this class and this podcast. And I just keep hearing over and over, slow down, just like slow, we just need to slow down. And the clarity comes as we ask these questions.
Yeah.
I mean, so you talked about it a little bit, but what are the mistakes we make, or what are the problems that arise when we don't take time to understand or see what's really going on?
Right. So if we miss seeing abuse, right, some of the things that can happen is we're going to ask victims to serve their spouse better. And in a sense, their spouse is all about, I always say they're kind of like bad kings. They want their kingdoms the way they want it. And so if we're asking them to serve them better, we're just feeding their husband's idolatry, right?
Well, oh my gosh. Yeah, right? We're contributing to the coercion. Wow.
And I hear that a lot. Pastors say, well, just keep your house clean or offer more sex or do these things. And really, she's just now serving more ways to be entitled. And the rules are always changing on the other side. So it's never going to be enough, right? And I think that's what's so hard. We have this person in front of us who typically wants to do whatever they can do to make the marriage good. And so we often lean our counsel on them to do things better. I mean, I'm not saying we don't ever do that, but that's not going to solve oppression. Other things that we do is we might keep a couple in marriage counseling. And so again, I'm saying things, asking her questions that she's not free to be honest with me. Or she might make the mistake of being honest with me and then receive a severe punishment later at home. And so just having them together increases her, decreases her safety. And so, misseeing it, we also then are just saying to someone, you should really live in these intolerable circumstances longer. And and sometimes our counsel goes so wrong as to say we blame them for their suffering. If you would just serve in these ways, this person would stop mistreating you, versus saying somebody's serious sin should have our attention.
Yeah. That's so helpful. I mean, it does. It highlights the fact that when we get this wrong, we don't just like miss it a little bit, right? We're compounding the experience, and I think why this patient knowledge is so important. And even, I mean, I think it's even helpful to identify the importance of having these conversations separately at times. And you don't have to be convinced that abuse is present then to say, hey, let's meet up separately and explore this, right? You're doing that as a information gathering act, not as a judgment.
Correct. Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of counselors that I work with now, they always will have one session with the couple together and just a standard of practice, one with each spouse alone, just to give opportunities for things to come up that would be be harder, right? Because marriage counseling isn't always appropriate, not just in areas of abuse, right?
Yeah.
But if there's unrepentant adultery or addiction, sometimes it's just wise to have information. Yeah.
That's so helpful. So helpful. Okay, so abuse then, I mean, thinking about the categories of suffering and sin, right? Abuse is fundamentally the result of, for the one who being abused, is fundamentally the result of suffering.
Yeah. Well, I would say it this way. It's fundamentally the result of someone else's sin.
Yes. Right?
And
so it's the experience of suffering. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So exactly. So it's the experience of suffering as the result of someone else's
sin against you and the Lord.
Yeah. How do you bring hope into that? How do you bring Scripture to bear carefully, compassionately, or where do you lead them? What do you want to help them see biblically regarding that suffering?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I'm thinking about counseling someone who's suffering abuse, typically I'm working with a victim probably for 6 months to a year before she can consistently say, my largest problem is the way that my spouse is treating me. So in the initial phases of counseling, again, it's like anxiety, depression, it's all these things. Then we're starting to uncover these relational patterns. And I will be saying, I feel like your husband was really dismissive of you. And I will typically get a response back, but if I would have kept the house cleaner, he wouldn't have been so irritated. Or I might say, well, last time you told me he was throwing things at you in the midst of the argument. Was there anything this week that made you feel physically afraid? Well, I brought up finances in the car and I knew I shouldn't have done that. So that made him really angry and he was driving erratically. So then there's this phrase where they're identifying the behavior, but they're seeing themselves as the cause. So for them, it's helping them see, helping them understand what the dynamics of oppression are so that they can label the behaviors and understand they can't make that other person sin against them in that way, right? And so that I would say it takes a sufferer a long time to understand the seriousness of their situation and sometimes even the danger that they're in. Like I will have women who've been greatly physically harmed, but he said he was sorry, but if I, the kids were unruly that night, I just didn't feel like having sex, and a man needs sex. And so therefore, right? So they almost are overly repentant. They overly responsible, however we want to put it. And so there's a tenderness of wanting to say, to help, I want them to know I'm also for their spouse, right? But wanting them to understand that the pattern that they're in. And then for me, probably the next juggernaut is for them to kind of understand their story a little better with categories, and that they can then reach out to key people in their lives for help. And that's probably where the first little bit of, I want to say, hope comes in. I mean, in one sense, that first phrase is I'm bringing clarity. I'm using the word of Scripture. I'm helping them see the things that are happening to them that the Lord hates, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm helping them not be confused. And then after they gain clarity, then I'm saying, this is what the Lord says about your situation. And these are the people that can help you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe you can tell me if this is because this is what we do. Even some of the older biblical counseling categories that come into my mind, or even like the category of ungodly guilt, right? Sometimes ungodly guilt is like I'm not believing that I'm genuinely forgiven for the things I've done wrong, but sometimes, like a lot of times, ungodly guilt is I'm experiencing guilt for things that aren't my responsibility, right? That
Correct.
That God says aren't on me.
Right.
And is that kind of what you're talking about?
It's exactly right. And so you think about that, if you're married to someone who's particularly, like if you're a Christian person married to someone who's abusing, they're usually using Scripture to shame you. Scripture, you wouldn't make me so angry if I didn't have to put up with this type of wife. And they're going to use Scripture. You're an unruly person. You're only out for yourself, right? And they're going to attack. So they're believing, right, the words of the person that they're living with attached to Scripture. And so right? It's helping them see what's the Lord's indictment of their heart. We want it to be accurate. We don't want it to be all these other things that they can't. It's just paralyzing. What do you do with guilt that isn't real guilt?
Yeah.
Right?
Because the answer is, right. The answer isn't you're forgiven, right?
Right.
I know it is for the things that you're supposed to own. The answer is you're forgiven. But for the ungodly guilt that we experience that isn't ours, the answer isn't you're forgiven. The answer is that's not actually yours to own. Right. It's not. That's on somebody else. And so that the clarity of that has to be so freeing, but has to take so long. I would imagine too.
Right.
That's not.
Yeah. Right. Because they're living in an intense environment where the message is so day in and day out. This is your fault. Right.
Yeah. So as you work with them then, so kind of clarity and even biblical clarity as to what is theirs, what's not, then reaching out and giving hope for the way forward. Do you along the way then like want to bring in scripture about the way in which God they can lament to God in the midst of their suffering, his redemption of suffering? Like, is that, or are there some pitfalls there as well?
That's a great question. So probably I would want to help them. The way I conceptualize in general, now there are people who fall outside this, right? And they come in, they recognize the abuse, and they're a little angry, right? They come in a little hot, right? But if I have someone that I'm saying, they are going from this journey of not understanding their situation. They are typically someone who's read every marriage book, who have journals this high of ways that they've prayed out to the Lord. And they're just saying, why won't the Lord help me? I must be a terrible wife, must be a terrible Christian. My past sins must have caused this to happen. And they often feel like the Lord has turned from them. So I tend to point them into this where the psalmist talks about when his own cries from his heart, like, why can't you see me? What's taking so long? And really just giving them the ability to voice that level of anguish and feeling left by the Lord is often that first juggernaut of helping them see that the Lord sees them. And that he's moved by their pain. They can't see it, right? I'm not there to witness it, but the Lord really does see. And that he is a God who's, when he hears the heart of his people who are suffering, I think about in Exodus, right? He heard the groans of his people and he says, I've come to rescue you. And the Israelites didn't even repent, right? They were just groaning. And so we have a Lord who is so moved by the suffering of others, and he sees, right? And he rescues. And so those are the places that because they can't see that they're not to blame. They can't see that they don't have guilt. So I'm heavily relying on the Lord's good character, his patience, his perseverance, his love for his people. And teaching them how to lament those, giving them permission really to speak to the Lord about their frustrations and failings is really where I start. Because people who are oppressed, right, if they would have done one thing characteristically is that they don't speak about the unspeakable things that are happening. And I don't think that's their fault. We're in women's Bible study, in what friendship, right? These are just not things that we talk about. So a huge act of faith, I look at it as a huge act of faith, is when they actually begin to complain and start to talk about what's happening. And so I want to help them then begin to speak those things before the Lord. And it doesn't look like progress, right? Because we're not solving oppression. The world's still chaotic, but it is huge spiritual progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about all the time just the huge act of faith that lament is, like the genuine biblical lament is, right? To voice that to God is a huge act of faith that I think. I think that's why so much of the Psalms consists of it. And it's so beautiful.
And why Jesus prayed them, right? I mean, I think that's right. They came through his mouth, which I think is just, he expressed agony, right? And so I'm constantly saying it's not a sin to be in agony. We can sin in the ways we choose to grumble or complain. I'm not saying that. But in and of itself, it's not a sin to be in agony. We've seen that in Jesus himself. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let me ask maybe one more question along these lines. As you walk with them through that as they come to realize, come to be able to lament, come to recognize the reality of their situation, see it regularly. Is there a point in that process where you do want to teach them about the redemption, like God's promises of redemption of their suffering? Or is that like a whole nother process in your mind? Like, is that is that something you eventually get to, or is that like something in a different, in a kind of a different iteration of their Christian life and is not really in this category of abuse?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think when I look at any one person that I've worked with, how their marriage, what the story for that particular marriage is so different, that I want to be really careful that I know that God's a redeeming God, but I don't know that he's going to redeem that particular marriage.
For sure.
So I will say things, I know God can do anything, and we're going to pray that God's going to redeem this marriage, that your husband, his blindness is going to be lifted, that he's going to do the hard things, and he's going to really repent, right? Those are the things we're praying for. But I don't know in your particular case what redeeming looks like. It could, right? And so I think that's just and in the area of abuse, it's not likely, right? Oppressors don't typically repent. So I have to kind of look at outcomes differently. If I see a woman who understands her oppression and then is protecting her kids, if I even see a marriage that ends, right? I don't delight in necessarily seeing the end of a marriage, but I see children who now understand their church says that is not how a husband is supposed to treat his wife, and they stay in the church, right? So like there's so many other there's ways that God is glorified in outcomes. They just necessarily aren't the ones that we initially hope for.
And actually, to clarify, I think that's actually what I mean by redemption. Like by redeeming, I'm not talking about like I'm not equating reconciliation with redemption.
Okay.
Although I think sometimes that does happen.
It does,
but oftentimes it does. When I'm thinking maybe in a more redemption in the more global sense of God's promises to, in Romans 5, right? To use this to redeem it by producing character that produces a genuine hope, that there might actually, hope's going to come out of this, even if some of the things on the surface that you hope for, right, don't come to fruition.
Right. You can have a devastating story and not be devastated by it.
Yeah.
Because you see how you can identify what the Lord is doing on your behalf and how believers are caring for you. So one way I will do that is, because the big picture tends to be so messy, is to really help every week. How have you seen the Lord meet you this week? Or we pray really concretely, and we keep a log of answered prayers, maybe not necessarily on paper, but oftentimes it's like in the smaller moments, them seeing God's faithfulness to them, and then being able to rehearse, this larger problem hasn't been solved, but I see the Lord showed up when this person had this encouraging conversation with me, or my elder called to pray with me, or my child, spared seeing this particular argument because they were at a friend's house that night, right? So I'm helping them see all the ways the Lord is at work, even though we can't see the whole narrative yet.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And actually, I think even this conversation is helpful, because I think this is the second time in a couple of weeks that I've used the term redemption. And I think about a marriage and a couple I was talking to, and they're like, I'm not sure there's a promise for reconciliation. And I'm like, that's not what I mean, right? But I think that oftentimes, even a lot of people in our churches assume that's the only God-honoring outcome. Yeah. Or that's the only type of redemption that exists. And so maybe that's even a broader, I think people have a broader understanding of seeing God work. Seeing God working in all sorts of different outcomes.
And I would use it the way you use it as well.
Yeah. So when I think categorically, I also think about wanting to meet people I want to meet people in the midst of their suffering. I also want to meet people in the midst of their sin, right? You talked about Mike Emlett's categories of saints and sinners and sufferers. Now, abuse is holy, and it's important that we are unequivocal about the fact that abuse is wholly the fault of the abuser, right?
Correct.
But every person that experiences abuse experiences it as a fallen person, right?
Right. Well, they're also sinners, right? It's just reality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so they experience that abuse. And would you say that experience is compounded by their own sin or fallenness? Or I mean, even saying that makes me a little bit like I don't know. Do I verbalize that? You're like, how do you conceptualize that?
So I think I think the way I think about it is I just have ministry priorities in my head. So I'm recognizing if someone is living in a life-dominating way, that they're enslaved to somebody else, that if they don't do something, they're going to be physically or sexually or emotionally harmed. I'm probably not most concerned about their sin initially. I'm probably really more concerned, like you said, with what the suffering they're enduring. I want them to have clarity of their situation. There might be times that I am interested in their sinful responses, and that's particularly when their sinful responses are making things worse for them. Like a lot of victims might use substance abuse because the amount of turmoil that they're in, or they might play in their mind with having an affair because they want out of the marriage. So there's certainly times that those things then become more urgent to me. I'm going to address them. Oftentimes when you are sinned against in such a way, I will talk about behaviors as ways that people resist being abused. So for instance, if you had a spouse who wouldn't pay for your child's things, one way you might resist abuse is you'd ask your mom to buy the snow boots or the soccer uniform or those things, right? And then we have to have, is there then deception or manipulation in there? That's not really going to be of interest to me. I'm thinking she's trying to provide for her child in a way that she's trying to remain safe and gets what the child needs. It's a way that she's resisting abuse. Other ways a woman might resist abuse might be providing sex on a schedule, right? Or doing things, right? These are ways that she's then not subjected to harsh treatment or lectures, right? So I'm helping her see ways. Now, there's going to be things the ways that she's resisting abuse that might be sinful, that maybe she's name calling, or I can't think of a great example, but I want to label it as these are the ways that you're resisting, the ways that you're trying to resist being manipulated, and are there ways that, or another way, like oftentimes you'll see someone who's in a physical altercation, right? She might hit or shove back, right? That's resisting. Now, would I tell her if her 6-foot husband was coming after her not to push him? No, right? Yeah. Right. So it's like we have to be very careful, like cause and effect of the whole train of behavior. But are there improvements she can make as she's resisting being manipulated? Sure. But in order to get into that level, she really has to have a strong conceptualization of understanding the patterns of coercive control and then how she's responding to them. And that takes clarity. Yeah. Then it doesn't mean I'm not addressing other, she might be having problems with gossiping about somebody else in the church. Not mean I'm not addressing other things, but if I'm worried
something
about
out on her kids or
right. And so to me, like parenting is a great example. I'm going to be checking in on how she's parenting, and in her case, I'm going to probably be pretty careful that I'm not going to shame her because that's how she experiences correction. Right. And so I'm going to be wanting to draw attention in, like you're saying, hopeful ways. How can I come alongside you and support your parenting? So when you're exasperated, you can make a better choice. I'm probably not even going to say what you're doing there is sinful. I'm probably just going to present a different way, invite her to live a different way with a very much, because she's so prone to being criticized. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm going to address it more creatively.
Yeah, I think it does. I think, and I think that in the context of those ministry priorities that you talked about, I think that's really helpful because you're trying to see where they're at, what they're hearing, right? When someone if someone experiences genuine conviction, then we apply the gospel, right? But if they hear conviction, but what they really experience is shame or condemnation, right? anytime that if they hear conviction, they experience condemnation. Well, then we're misconnecting, right? That's not the answer.
Exactly.
And it makes me. So I think that there are some things that we want, or there are things that we want to both correct, but even more just apply the truth and the hope of the gospel to, right? The forgiveness of the gospel. You know, it makes me, what comes to my mind, and you can correct me if again, like this is like, I don't know, quicker or applied, but I think of if somebody's going through the false guilt that they're experiencing. I think the more that we experience and come to know who God is, right? Then we get comfort and we're reminded that, okay, I feel guilty about this. You're like, that's not yours. Like, I feel guilty about this. Like, that's not yours.
Right.
As we're coming to know Christ more and more, and as we draw into him in comfort, there's probably also going to be things where like, you know, I'm also feeling guilt for the way I'm screaming at my kids as a result.
Exactly.
And so we meet them there and say, and we don't say, well, no, that's not yours, right? We say,
Correct.
oh no, that Jesus, there's no condemnation for it in Christ Jesus.
Amen.
Right? His forgiveness. So we help to apply his forgiveness, the gospel truth that reinforces the same gentle goodness, kindness, that also brings the comfort as well. And so in that sense, convictions, we should probably expect convictions going to come.
Well, absolutely. And I would say, like most victims that I counsel, they come in with all their failings. I usually don't have to point them out, right? They'll say, I don't like the way I was upset with my children. I don't like this about myself. I don't like the way I'm responding under stress. And so in some sense, it makes my job a lot easier, like you're saying. And I'll say, well, this is how the Lord sees you, and this is what he calls you to. And I think it's... Our job is unique then because you have someone who doesn't feel like they have any agency over their life, right, or any dominion, which God gave them in the garden, right? They feel completely powerless. And we're saying, no, how you parent or how you do this still has an impact, right? And so it's kind of helping them, walk that out. Helping them make those micro choices when they feel powerless, because all they can see is the failure. Yeah.
That's so helpful. So, in those instances, right, when someone says like, and I think you're probably right that far more often their failings are going to be in front of them. Like, they don't need like you to point them out. Like they're
some do, but rarely.
Yeah. And I actually think that's true kind of across the board, right? We open up God's word with people 95% of the time. They correct themselves because they're like, oh, I see what's going on here, right? So when those things come up, are there just examples of maybe passages you might take them to in order to apply that salve of
I like
truth?
Philippians 4 actually, right? Because it talks about the anxiety, and victims usually struggle with anxiety, be anxious for nothing. And then it talks about praying, moves into with prayer. And then it goes into this beautiful passage, whatever is true, whatever is noble, right? Concentrate on these things. And so then it kind of gives them a place to take their anxieties, a way to turn in prayer, and it gives them action steps, because those are great fruit. And so what is true in this situation? What would bless another person? Like, these are the things we want to think about. Because I feel like that chapter just really kind of has all of their heart in it. But it also says, these are the ways that you can think, these are the things that you can be centered on as you walk forward. Maybe what's true is that it's a big, fat, ugly mess, but the Lord sees you, right? And what is pure is like the only thing that is pure is the Lord's heart. Maybe yours isn't, but you can rest in his impeccable care of you. And so I think I find that passage is particularly helpful.
I love that. That is really helpful and helpful because of both the truth it contains and the invitation it contains, right? It's so personal and concrete. So, yeah. And I think even the heart of it's such a correction from, I think what people can tend to think about when they think about Philippians 4. Oh, that's one that tells me not to be anxious. Like, right. Well, no. It's like it's this beautiful invitation into the one who we can be at peace with, right? To the God of peace. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Okay, so beyond our words, then I want to think about, and I I don't think I minister in these utilizing these categories, but I find them like as pedagogically helpful, right?
Yep,
As we kind of cover our bases. When thinking about how we can not just speak words of truth, but serve them, come alongside and practically care for those. I think that maybe for those that are experiencing abuse, maybe even in the midst of it, that what we do practically maybe as, if not more important than even the words we say.
Correct.
What are some of those actions that we ought to be ready to take, eager to take when we are convinced that abuse has taken place?
Yeah, so I think about, how Jesus came, giving up all his power and dominion, and he just gently woos us, right? And so I want to have the same stance. I don't want to be another person standing over them like their spouse saying you should. And it's going to be really tempting. So, when I'm fearing, particularly when I'm worried about escalating physical danger, I want to tell someone you should do this. You should make a safety plan. You should tell your pastor. I want to be highly directive. But that's not helpful because they don't need another person seeking to control them. So in a sense, I want to do the same thing. I want to woo them towards the truth and towards the Lord's rescue, saying, these are some of the options, right? Why would you choose this? Why might not you choose this? How come you think it's safe to go home? So I'm having a different kind of conversation, even though because my sense of urgency, I'm often afraid for somebody. I have to recognize, nope, the Lord has them. And it's okay that it is slow. The Bible is highly repetitive, right? The Lord is so patient. So I think that's just another way that we do that. We don't get exasperated. We just keep whispering sweet truths and great invitations. Another way is I think Jesus made himself little, right? And so it's, again, I'm not being highly directive, but I'm much more, I do want to say little in the room. So I'm reacting to what people are saying. But again, I want to be very calm, patient. I don't want them sensing disapproval for me, frustration with me. It really has to be very focused on the other person. I also want to model, I think, they're going to learn about the Lord's heart from them by seeing me affected by their story. So, like you're saying, propositional truth is good, but experiential truth is going to make it really stick. And so I just, the way the Lord made me, I often tear up, right? Or am just really impacted by what someone's saying to me. Other times I'm just saying, when you told me that story, I felt physically sick because of what's happened to you. I'm letting them know that what they're saying has impacted me. Not in a sense to make them, I don't want them to caretake for me, but I'm just saying your story there's such a darkness to it that it has this impact on me. I'm affected by what I'm hearing. So I think, there's just this patience. I cannot stress patience enough.
That's so helpful.
Will be another.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind is that biblical word meekness, right? That virtue, that biblical virtue of meekness, particularly situation. It strikes me. I'm not a small or quiet person.
I'm not typically.
And
not at home.
And so no, it strikes me even just I think back to how many situations in which even the way I can communicate truth can miscommunicate it.
Right.
Because of the power, size, or, way in which it's conveyed that...
well, you're probably sure about things too, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so helpful. That's so helpful. What about ways in which, it strikes me, and I want to explore a little bit because you said it, ways in which we can serve them by helping to protect them, by the church standing in the gap. Like, what does it look like when the church functions at its best?
That's a great question.
To stand in the gap when people are at risk.
Yeah,
or
so
in danger.
The church functions at its best when a victim comes to them. Particularly, I prefer to go with them as a counselor and to say, this is my story, and them to be moved by their story. Again, they're going to be wondering, is this true? How accurate is this? And really, upon a first disclosure of abuse, the church does best just to listen and ask questions that say, tell me more about that aren't challenging questions, right? That really are drawing out that story. And then they're asking the victim, what do you need? Some victims will not want the church to engage their oppressor because they know that means that they're going to have to leave the church, or there's going to be higher conflict. Anytime that happens, two victims are in a more dangerous situation. And so oftentimes churches get this information and they want to act on it, but it's not safe to do that. So it's being really sensitive and helping the victim maybe come to a place where she wants that to happen, but respecting her wishes not to. And then if they're getting involved, with the oppressors, saying what would be helpful. And sometimes they just say, could you help with his parenting style, or could you help us with a budget? Other times they're saying, hey, could you really get involved and confront him on these serious sin patterns? And then what's best there is if it just has to be, sadly, it's resource heavy. It just takes a lot of people to be involved in a situation. Each party's going to need different advocates, counselors, and somebody to kind of function at the middle of the situation. Because when confrontation starts to take place, the oppressor often tells conflicting stories. They're manipulating with their words. So somehow the information loop has to get closed. So they have to constantly be going back to the victim and saying, I heard this, help me understand this. And then again, they have to decide, if we're going to have these engagements with your oppressor, is it safer for you to be separated when we're doing that? Do we need to do a safety assessment? Has the counselor done one? Do we work with the local shelter to see her risk? Is her body not tolerating what's happening? Does she need a break? So it's very victim-centered, which sometimes makes us uncomfortable because we want a flow chart, right?
Yeah.
But it's so messy, so complicated, so many layers of danger. A church does it well when what I would say, every time I've seen a church do it well, is because they're willing to learn about the victim. They're willing to learn about abuse. They're willing to ask for help if they've never done this before. And they're saying, we're thinking we're going to do this. Tell us why that is a good idea or why that isn't. Right. And so, but again, their ministry priority should be her safety. And then addressing if possible, right? Addressing the oppressor's attitudes that fuel his abuse. Yeah. If it's safe. It's a lot. To accomplish.
It is.
Yeah.
It totally is. It's also the call, right? It's what the church is called to be, even when it is a lot.
Yep.
It's also really encouraging to me to that. I think even as a pastor, sometimes I feel the pressure to always be the one who knows what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And to even say like that the church is at its best as a learner of the situation, that there's going to be unique dynamics and that there's not a cookie cutter that we're just going to apply to abuse. And then in the midst of that learning of the uniques of the situation, to also be a learner and ask for help when you're beyond your
absolutely
own wisdom or experiential knowledge. I actually, the way you described it, I think it does sound like a lot. It's like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. But the way you described it actually felt really hopeful to me. And anyways, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. What, and I imagine that that's then true as well with when and how we serve them by engaging the legal authorities as well.
Absolutely. Right. Right. Always we're reporting child abuse because sometimes that is right. 50% of men physically abuse their spouse also are abusing their children. Anytime we see a child witnesses sex abuse, that's abuse. So sometimes we are calling the legal authorities, but it's much for children. That's much more complicated, right? Because now when the Child Protective Services come out, her risk of danger is sky high. So now we really have to make sure she's protected. We cannot, can be frustrating. Oftentimes I'll have victims and I want to say to them, feel free to call the police because you want a record of the abuse. They often don't. And we put them in more danger if we do. And police typically won't respond to that call because they know until a victim's ready to make decisions for their safety, interfering. Now, if there's some imminent danger, that's different. Like if we're hearing a fight that's going on or something like that. But in some sense, we're so limited in the way we can intervene in the abuse. It's difficult.
Is that I'm not even sure I know kind of all the different perspectives that are out there. Is that a controversial perspective? Like, is there an angle that would say like, no, we need to go to the authorities for them, or is that something that?
Yeah, most of police departments wouldn't act on that call for the reason of them knowing them showing up would put her at more risk until she's ready to take greater safety measures. There's only one state, I think, I don't know which one it is. I think it's out west where you have to report domestic abuse, but it's not. We're not compelled to report, and often reporting puts a victim in more danger.
Okay.
Yep.
That's helpful.
But we want to be telling them, I support you if if he strangles you, if he's throwing things at you, if he's doing this, we support you calling the police. Oftentimes as pastors, we say that to victims. They're like, oh, okay. They're afraid to do that if we don't give them permission.
Yeah. And we were having this, we were having a tangential but conversation with our counselors here at the church recently. And, the question comes up, well, are we mandated reporters for child abuse? And in California, the legal answer is yes. But I also think morally, when it comes to kids, like it is going to make the situation more complicated. But as those that are can't make those choices for themselves.
Exactly.
We even just morally need to step in. Is that?
Yeah. No, I agree.
That's what I said to them. Would you agree? Now I need to know how I said.
That's true. And that's a difference, right, between we're looking at now, if I had a woman who is elderly or disabled, right, then I'm thinking about it differently. But I have someone she's making that choice, and I have to. I'm uncomfortable with that choice, believe you me. But I have to respect that because I know it's going to put her in more danger, right? Because anytime there's an engagement or a failed engagement or a failed separation, the abuse escalates. Yeah.
That's so helpful, and I think it's super helpful, and I think super clarifying, and so much wisdom in that. Okay, so what about I always like to ask. I always like to ask about resources and other places we can go. What about though? It seems like for somebody who's in the midst of that, what they need most is people. Right? Is like people in their lives, not like a book. Here's read this. But are there resources you would utilize with those that are struggling? That are in the midst of abuse?
Absolutely. So if I had a victim. So I like to use my book, Is It Abuse? That's really meant to be used with pastors or caregivers or the person walking alongside it. I do have a little mini book called Domestic Abuse, Help for the Sufferer. And that's something that they could read directly. And I find that's really helpful. It talks to the confusion, talks to the dynamics, helps them understand who's responsible. I love a book by Holcomb and Holcomb, Is It My Fault? Again, that's really helpful. And it has a lot of good theology in it as well, which I find the more scripturally rooted. If you're talking to someone who has a story where there is physical violence, most of the victims I see in the church, there's emotional abuse and sexual abuse, but there's not physical abuse. And so if you give them a book that's predominantly physical abuse, they're not going to map onto it, right? Because, he's not beating me. But if there is the physical abuse, Joy Forrest has a book. She, as a survivor, she's a Christian woman. She's written Called to Peace, which is excellent. And so, there's that. Chris Moles has written, again, How to Help the Oppressor. He's fantastic. And so, I think there's a plethora of resources. But for victims, I think what they really need is slow and steady truth that someone else has kind of metabolized for them and can slowly help them. Even if they have a book, you should help them be reading it with them.
For sure. No, that's super helpful. And that's what I find too, that there is a plethora of resources. But most of them have been written in the last 10 years though. Right. And so I think that's what's particularly helpful is they're newer and I want to make sure that we're aware and highlighting them in the context of local church, because sometimes we
miss them.
So what books or articles or trainings would you suggest to somebody wanting to minister to somebody who's abused? So I would suggest your book, Abused, which I think, I do think was super helpful for me. The clarifying questions in there, even just kind of the help to give you something to go from. It helped my creativity in question asking and navigating both the breadth of it, but also I think you in there have a helpful distinction between what's like just problematic marriage problems and what's abusive. What is abuse? I think that's helpful. But what else? I mean, have you found helpful?
Yeah, before I forget too, there's a safety plan in the back of my book. But speaking of, for the first question, is the National Domestic Hotline is a great resource for any victim that they should kind of have that plugged into their phone in a crisis to someone help them talk through things too. And they can help with safety plans. Other resources for helpers, again, I love Chris Moles' The Heart of Domestic Abuse. That's if you're working on the oppressor side. Jeremy Pierre and Greg Wilson just came out with a great book, When Home Hurts, and that's on the church engagement side. If you're tasked with having the counselors with conversations with both parties, there's actually scripts in there what you can say, and walking out some of those ministry priorities, how to execute that. Those are like my favorites. The other ones that might be, I love Diane Langberg's Suffering in the Heart of God, only because when you do this amount of work, you see so much darkness, and she's particularly adept at walking in the darkness. And so I do think we want to know who the Lord is in these hard places, because our faith gets challenged, to be honest, right? So I find that book particularly helpful there. So I think going back to, if these are your first engagements with abuse, I think it's just so helpful to say, there's a lot I don't know. And if I make an assumption, my assumptions, if I'm counseling someone with anxiety, the mistake that I'm going to make is probably not going to lead to a detrimental wound, right? It's just the impact for our mistakes are just less. And so I think like a curriculum like Church Cares really helps you go through it and think, what are my first best steps? And that's just a free web-based source. If you're just new to it and you think, gosh, I feel overwhelmed by the situation, I don't know what my first step is. And then I think really just partnering with someone who has experience. I think these are cases that we want to have supervision for. I know my pastor often calls me, but he often calls pastors that have mentored him and say, this is a situation. I think being really well networked, talking it out with someone else is really priceless. Who just has just more experience than you do. There's nothing beats a live person.
Totally. That's so true. So any any last thoughts as we wrap up? Anything that maybe I haven't asked that I should have asked, or even maybe angles that you just want to highlight or would want to leave people with, or leave me with?
I think you've asked it in different ways. Is just the impact on children. We've talked about it in the issue of abuse. We've talked about it when it comes to parenting. But I often think there is so much damage happening to children that oftentimes we look at this situation and we see it as a marriage problem, which it isn't, right? There's one person that has this sin problem that's so dominating. It takes such a mental shift just to prioritize the problem that way. And then we easily get overwhelmed by all that has to be done in victim care. But if there are people if this is church-based counseling, you're typically going to have access to children and see the effects that it has on children. I know the first batch of women I counseled, they felt really convicted to stay married for the sake of their children. And I would say 9 out of 10 of those kids walked away from the church. and the Lord. And the spiritual wounds of children just going through this are really hard. And so, yeah, that's there's a chapter in my book on that, but I just think we talk about someone who is just subjected to suffering when it's not their fault. The children are highly impacted in ways that I think that we just have to have. We're already overwhelmed, I guess. So I'm just saying, in the midst of everything else you're trying to attend to, just have an eye on the littlest victims, in a sense.
I actually, I think it's so helpful and important. And I think that it actually gets to even back to the question of how can the church do this best? I think as a pastor or as a counselor, it's like completely overwhelming to be like, and also think about the children. But as the church, right? Like ideally, like the church would be built in a way that those kids have their own connection points. They have people that we can task with, engaging with them, just connecting with them, even just being a resource to talk with, to spend
having
time.
them over for dinner and seeing what a normal family dinner looks like, right? Or what a good Christian man actually looks like. Yeah.
And I think that's a really helpful reminder, because I think sometimes we can get in like the counseling silo, right? Of like, okay, I'm like ministering to the person in front of me where in the context of the church, God's calls for us to care kind of across the board and to come around as a community, around
families,
these families in crisis. I mean, it was a family in crisis, and a crisis caused by a particular member, and which, when it's caused by a member within the family, it's more complicated of a crisis to come around, but it's maybe even more needed as any other crisis. So. That's super helpful. Well, thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate it. It was great to meet you and
absolutely
get to, like you said, face-to-face is always better. It's even more of a blessing than reading your book, but which has been a huge encouragement to me. So I really do appreciate your time and appreciate the thoughtful work that you've put into this that so many of us can glean from.
No, thank you. And thank you for highlighting the issue and slowing down and spending the time on it, because it's not a fun one to talk about. So I really appreciate it.
For sure.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And for those of you listening, thanks so much for joining us as well. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you taking the time to think through.
Absolutely.
I mean, if we're, this amount of time on a podcast, if you've listened all the way here, a huge thanks to you, because I think this is that important. And we're thankful for the investment that you're making to even be equipped this much more in it. So thank you. And we'll see you next time.